is Rosh Yeshiva at Hadar, and I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to Hadar's Spring Lecture Series. It's wonderful to be here with hundreds of you from all around the country and the world for what we hope will be yet another investigation moment of learning and exploration, as we've been able to do in this virtual Beit Midrash over the past year. Tonight is really a special opportunity and moment for learning, both because of the topic and the person teaching it. The topic, the Torah of reopening, captures the moment we are in right now, which is being between what's been a really challenging and dark and isolating year, and the beginning of a feeling for some of us already in concrete ways of beginning to reconnect, to come together, to think about how we reopen, to think about how we go from the pattern of our lives this past year to what it might be in the years ahead. And I can't think of anyone who is poised to do this learning and teaching with us better than my colleague, Rabbi Tali Adler. Rav Tali serves on the faculty at Hadar and is someone who, if you don't already know, you'll learn tonight and in the coming weeks, has an uncanny ability to take us into the depths of what Torah has to offer, even as she pushes us into the depths of our own souls and the deepest questions that we carry with us. So thank you for being here. We hope you'll join us for this week, future weeks of this series, and for all the other offerings we have online at hadar.org. Check it out, be a part of this learning community. And I'll hand it over now to Rav Tali.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Tan. It occurred to me when planning this series that it's particularly meaningful that today was Pesach Sheni. Pesach Sheni is the day that is the sort of the makeup for Pesach. For those who were ritually impure and unable to bring a sacrifice in the temple at its proper time, on Pesach, this is the day that they're able to. And this is particularly poignant for me as we begin these series because so many of us last Pesach, last Passover, believed that this would be over by the time Pesach Sheni rolled around. We didn't know. So many of us who missed having Seder, missed getting together with our family, with our friends last year, thought that it would be a month, maybe a little bit more, and the world would be back to normal. And I don't think many of us anticipated this lasting so long that we would actually need help reorienting ourselves at the end. But I think that's where we actually find ourselves. At the end of, for many synagogues, 60 plus weeks of not praying indoors, we find ourselves, in some places at least, beginning to open up again. I want to tag, by the way, that in some places this isn't true. We know that in some areas of the world, the pandemic is actually at its height, and I want us to keep that in mind even as we engage with what it means for those of us who are in the places where we can get back to some semblance of quote unquote normal life. I want us to remember that for so many people, that's not true yet. And so at the end of this year, plus at the end of these 60 weeks, there are feelings that I think some of us, most of us expected. There is joy, there's exhilaration, there's excitement. And there are also, for some of us, more complicated feelings. Fear, loss, grief at what the past year took from us, nervousness about what will it look like to reunite with the people we missed so much over the past year. What on earth does it look like to rebuild our communities after this year? Are they going to look the same? Do we want them to look the same? Would it even be possible for them to look the same when we have changed so much? Those are some of the themes we're going to be exploring over the next 3 weeks. Today, where I want to start with is what I call the fear before we open the door. And by that I mean the following. This isn't true for everyone, but one thing that has surprised me about myself, and that has been fairly common in conversations that I've had with other people about the reopening, is that there is a sense of fear for many of us of what it's going to mean. That fear can sometimes be about, I am not sure what my life is going to look like at the other end of this. It's sometimes about, actually, there are moments of this past year, as painful as it was, as hard as it was, that I actually loved. And part of it is simply about, this is a change and I don't know how to process that. I think that in our general world, we like big, flashy moments of what I'll call liberation. And to acknowledge the fears that go along with that is not always part of our shared vocabulary. What I'm hoping that we'll do tonight is actually begin to build a religious vocabulary using moments from Torah, using moments from our shared religious heritage, to pinpoint what some of the fears we're holding are, look at those moments and say, I recognize them, they're actually deeply human, and also begin to work on what it takes to move through those fears together, what it takes to open the door. Bachi, if you wouldn't mind to begin screen sharing. Today we'll be looking at primarily at texts from the book of Bamidbar, from the book of Numbers. And the reason we're jumping in there is because Bamidbar tells the story of what happens after liberation, after what happens after you open the door for the first time. We spend so much of our time in our religious lives talking about the moment of the Exodus. It's a moment of complete clarity. It's a moment that we've waited for. It's a moment that our ancestors prayed and waited for, just as so many of us prayed and waited for the certain moments this year. The first time, please God, that we'll be able to go out of our houses without masks. The first time for so many of us that we were able to hug our parents again, our siblings again. The first time for so many of us that we'll be able to pray indoors with our communities once again. But Bamidbar tells the story of what happens after that moment. Bamidbar tells the story of the Israelites who walk through that moment and come out the other end a little bit scared and confused, and sometimes longing terribly for what they left behind. We're going to today look at one of those moments and some of the commentaries on what the Israelites were actually longing for in the moment that they complained about being liberated, in the moment where they longed to go back to Egypt. And what I'm going to ask all of us to do as we read through these sources is to identify, if you can, what am I actually scared about, if anything, as I begin this process of opening? What, if anything, am I worried about missing? What, if anything, do I identify in this text as speaking to me? As we go through each text, I'll take a moment after we read and analyze each one to check the chat. And if that resonated with you, if the text that we learned speaks to something in your opening experience, I would love if you would share it with the group. Let's dive in. Bamidbar 11. The people took to complaining bitterly before the Lord. The Lord heard and was incensed. A fire of the Lord broke out against them, ravaging the outskirts of the camp. The people cried out to Moses. Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. That place was called Tavera because a fire of the Lord had broken out against them. The riffraff in their midst felt a gluttonous craving, and then the Israelites wept and said, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish that we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. Now our gullets are shriveled. There is nothing at all, nothing but this manna to look forward to. Let's scroll down. Now the manna was like coriander seed, and in color it was like bdellium. The people would go about and gather it, grind it between millstones, or pound it in a mortar, boil it in a pot, and make it into cakes. It tasted like rich cream. When the dew fell on the camp at night, the manna would fall upon it. Moses heard the people weeping, every clan apart, each person at their entrance of his tent. The Lord was very angry, and Moshe was distressed. Here's our central scene. Our central scene is a moment of longing. All the people are being given to eat is the man, this miraculous substance that's described in the second paragraph. Like coriander seed, it could be prepared in all different ways. It tasted like rich cream, and it comes with no effort every day. The people did go out to collect it each day, but it's not a high effort food. And yet, despite that, the people in this moment are desperately missing something from the home that they left behind. They're desperately missing the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic, and most of all, the meat and the fish that they had in the land of Egypt. Now, this text is taken in very different ways by some commentaries. Some commentaries see this as actually indicative of the people's utter corruption. The Gemara actually cites an opinion that perhaps the people are not only longing for the food that they left behind in Egypt, or perhaps not longing for that at all, but longing for all sorts of now forbidden sexual relations that were now forbidden to them. That point of view is looking at this text and saying, how dare you? You have experienced God, God's self. You have been liberated from the most dangerous thing, the most terrible thing. How dare you? And there are others, and we'll be looking at those commentaries tonight, who look at this and say, this makes sense. This is actually incredibly human. And on some level, how could they not experience this? Let's dive into what those commentaries do. We're starting with a text from the Kedushat Levi, a Hasidic commentary. If only we had meat, we remember the fish. The Kedushat Levi points out that this is a bit of a non sequitur. If only we had meat, we remember the fish. That is not what one would expect. If only we had meat, I remember the steak, I remember the lamb, something along those lines. What does it mean we remember the fish? What is the link between meat and remembering fish? In the man, the Jewish people could taste whatever they wished, the only caveat being that it had to be a taste that they had experienced and would think about it while eating the man. Any food that they had never eaten, they could not experience it in the man. Let's start with this. The Kedushat Levi is citing an idea that originates in the midrash, that the man is miraculous not only in how it's provided, but something happens with the man such that all you have to do to experience any taste in the world you want is imagine that food and you would actually taste it in the man. Now, on some level, by the way, that adds to the critique of the people. Why are you missing meat? Why are you complaining about missing all of these foods? You can taste anything that you want, anything at all in this food. What are you actually complaining about? What's amazing about the Kedushat Levi is that he takes that idea and actually says, yes, but there still is something that they can miss. And that's because any food that they had not tasted, they couldn't experience. And now there's actually an additional limit on that. Let's keep reading. Kosher meat has a particular taste because of the way it is slaughtered and salted than non-kosher meat. Kosher meat tastes different from non-kosher meat because of the salting practice, and even according to this, because of the way that it's slaughtered. In Egypt, the Jews had only ever eaten non-kosher meat, and therefore did not yet know what kosher meat tasted like, and therefore could not taste it in the man. Now, after the giving of the Torah, they were commanded regarding salting and slaughtering the meat. And because of this, they did not yet know that how they could continue to taste the taste of the meat in the man. but they could still taste the fish, which was not affected by any mitzvah. And this is what it means when they said, if only we had meat in order to be able to taste it now in the man. We remember the fish, we are still able to experience the taste of fish in the man, but not the taste of meat. Let's take a moment to unpack this. Because of the way that the man works, you can only experience taste that you have tasted before. The Jews are now obligated in eating only kosher meat, and they had never experienced the taste of kosher meat. This is taking, by the way, for granted the idea that obviously you're forbidden to wish for the man to taste like something that is actually forbidden to you. Perhaps the man won't do that, or perhaps it is forbidden to you to wish for it. And because of that, the people are actually left with an experience that they can never return to, and an experience that they cannot yet access because they haven't experienced it yet. And I want us to take a moment to really think about what this means. In this moment where the Jewish people are revolting against God, it's because they are caught between losing something that they once had, even if that something that they once had was in the middle of difficulty, and being unable to access something that they cannot yet imagine. It's something that I think we all experience when we're starting something new. There's often a longing to run back, to retreat to comfort, and also a discomfort because we cannot yet imagine what the other side will look like. Any change that is meaningful is a change that brings with it unimagined worlds. And that in that moment is what the Jews are experiencing. That longing, that fear, is the fear of unimagined worlds. We'll tie this back more explicitly to our experiences in the reopening in a moment, but I want us all to be thinking right now about what are experiences that I may no longer have access to after this year, and what are the places that I don't yet know what they'll look like. What are the things that I'm afraid of because I have not imagined them yet? Where am I caught in this quandary of the man can no longer taste like what I once had, and I cannot imagine what it will taste like, what it would taste like if I could have it, what this future possibility is. As a note of comfort, by the way, the Kedushat Levi ends with this idea. And in the future, the Holy One will make a feast from the Leviathan and the Shor Habor. The Shor Habor is this massive mythic beast that it said will be slaughtered and fed to the righteous at the feast that God makes for them in the time of the Mashiach. Because in truth, the Jewish people will eat manna just as they did when they left Egypt, and God will make them a feast from these things so that the Jewish people will be able to taste them when they eat the manna. There's a little bit of comfort here. God recognizes that it's impossible to really taste, to really experience things that you haven't had yet. There's an acquiescence here to the human limits of imagination and the fear that comes with the limits of imagination. And there's a promise here that the next time there's a new world, God is actually going to prepare us, to fortify us with the Leviathan and the Shor Habor so that our imaginations are actually broadened enough to be able to experience everything that we want to, that we need to in the new world. I'm going to go to the chat now. And again, the question that I want us all to be thinking about right now is, where are the places that we might be experiencing fear in the face of reopening because of the limits of our imagination? And again, when I say limits of imagination, that's not a critique, that's human. I'm going to dive in. Oh wow, people are really using the chat. I'm very excited about this. I'm going to dive in to Claudia Harris. Grief is normal and it isn't solely sadness, also disbelief, what if only, and anger, and then eventually acceptance, integrating the loss into one's life and moving forward. I've pendulated through all of them in the last year, and by accepting each emotional experience, I can move on through it more easily. I love that, and I also want us to keep in mind that that skill of accepting and moving forward through the feelings is going to be necessary in this reopening process as well. Rachel Gross, maybe being able to taste but not experiencing the full process was harder than never having it. I think that that's going to be hinted to, alluded to in one of the other sources that we're going to see. Let's see who else. Gary Goldberg, there's a difference between the experience of what one might imagine it could or might be versus the experience of what one recalls what one had once experienced. I think that's completely true, and I think that that's a big part of the fear that happens when we move forward. Imagination is a wonderful thing, and it isn't tangible. I love the foods that they evoke in this moment. Onion, garlic, they're strong tastes, they're tastes that when you think of them, you can almost experience. And the longing for them is so robust in the face of a yet unimagined new taste. I want to read this comment by Adina Gerber, and then we're going to jump back in. I'm so sorry that I don't think I'm going to be able to read all the comments in the chat, but I really encourage you to read the comments as we go through. And I'm just so grateful that people are volunteering their experiences in this way. Adina Gerber, for me, the fear is about seeing how much things have changed. Not only other people who have changed and things that have changed, but how much I have changed and been changed by this pandemic. Confronting loss on a very personal level, it's terrifying, important, but scary. That's beautiful, and I think in some ways actually touching on a few of the themes that are going to come through in the next few texts. So let's go there. We're looking now at the Be'er Mayim Chayim from the Midbar 11, on the same text in Midbar 11. And this is the meaning of the riffraff in their midst felt a gluttonous craving, literally desired desire, that they desired to experience the desire that they had felt. And this is why they said, we remember the fish that we ate in Egypt. It says in Masechet Sota, in the merit of the righteous women that were in that generation, the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. At the time when these women would go to draw water, the Holy One, blessed be He, would materialize for them small fish that would enter their pitchers, and they would therefore draw pitchers that were half filled with water and half filled with fish. And they would then come and place 2 pots on fire, one pot of hot water for washing their husbands, and 1 pot of fish with which to feed them. And they would then take what they prepared to their husbands to the field, and they would bathe their husbands and anoint them with oil, and feed them the fish and give them to drink and bond with them between the sheepfolds. Let's take a step back for a moment. The Be'er Mayim Chayim says that what the Jews are actually craving in this moment is the very feeling of craving, they're desiring the very feeling of desire. And to begin to explain that, he jumps into a story that appears in Masechet Sota, Tractate Sota, that imagines what is it that the Jews did in some ways to create beauty for themselves in Egypt. And it tells the story of what the Jewish women would do. And I want us to pay attention to the detail here, the very small things that they're using in order to create moments of beauty. The fish that come into the jug, the pots on the stove, 1 of water, 1 of fish, taking that, going out into the fields for a few stolen moments with their husbands. That moment, those moments of anointing, those moments of being together under the stars, presumably. And all that disappears when they leave Egypt. In the midst of all the suffering, in the midst of all the pain, there were stolen moments of beauty that actually they can no longer access once they're gone. And let's see what the Be'er Mayim Chayim does with that. And this is why they said, we remember the fish, because in Egypt, the Holy One wanted to increase our desire more and more and cause the fish to materialize in our wives' jugs as a result. And it was because we were free of mitzvah that our desire was increased in order to become fruitful and multiply. And now that we've received the mitzvah, we've been deprived of all the goodness of the world in order to lessen our desire. The Be'er Mayim Chayim goes in a direction with this. Why did they say we remember the fish? Because they're remembering the fish that came to them. They're remembering those stolen meals that they had together, those moments of beauty. And they're saying, you know why we were able to do that? Because we didn't have mitzvot then. In some way, having mitzvot, having this robust system actually took away their, what I'll call, deep desire. And this, as the Be'er Mayim Chayim is painting it, works in some metaphysical way. The being bound to a robust system of mitzvot, I think for the Be'er Mayim Chayim actually changes something about the human soul fundamentally. But I want us to think for a moment about what are the moments of beauty that we experienced in the pandemic? How did they happen? I'm particularly enchanted here by the image of the pots on the stove. I think that for many of us, the moments of beauty that we were able to create were related in some way or another to food. I think that's what the sourdough bread craze was about. I don't know if anyone is still baking sourdough bread, but if you are, more power to you. And the question of what do we do with the loss that comes when that's no longer available? And also, what happens when we return to a robust set of outside obligations? Many of us have been working through the pandemic, that's true. But what does it look like when we go back to needing to travel outside the home all the time? What happens when we go back to, for many of us, not for all of us, many of us, our very structured lives filled with all sorts of obligations, work, social, and otherwise that may have been different for us during the pandemic? And what happens when we're worried about, will that take away these moments of beauty from me? What happens when I'm no longer working at home and can't actually cook myself a meal for lunch? It's a little small thing, and yet it's a moment of beauty that took me through this past year. And it's a moment of beauty that I'm going to mourn for once it's gone. We'll leave the Be'er Mayim Chayim here for now. I want to look at what people are saying in the chat. Joan Winograd, the pandemic has caused me to be even more committed to a vegan diet and to environmental causes, to be attentive to the earth, to be sensitive to the suffering of animals, and to promote good physical and mental health. That's amazing, and I really hope that you keep it up after the pandemic. Bob Schloss, they remember the sensual life of the past, which now that they have the mitzvot has been replaced by a life of discipline. And we are now so disciplined about our face masks, about our hand washing, about our social distance, about bringing our proof of vaccination. Yes, so part of what I love that you're pointing out is that in this life of confinement, in this life of COVID, there are other robust systems of discipline. Presumably for the Jews in Egypt, those were also there. I'm sure that the Egyptians had an equally, much more, I will not say equally, the masks are not slavery by any stretch of the imagination. I'm sure that the Egyptians had a robust system of obligation, and yet the moments that they were able to carve out there are not identical to the moments that are available to them once they leave. There is something about when you enter a new system, when you enter a new system of obligation, of requirements, that actually sometimes makes moments of beauty from your old life inaccessible. And I think for some of us, as we think about reopening, this is part of what's coming up in our worry. What happens to those moments now? Will I ever actually be able to experience them again? Jay Schwartz, I'm worried that the separation caused by COVID will increase my own personal narrowness, Mitzrayim of my ability to experience my world. How do we regain our ability to enjoy everyday miracles and joys? I love that, and I think that that is most of what next class will be about, the class about reunions and how to ritualize those. How do we re-access parts of ourselves that we feel like we've lost? I'll read this comment from Akiva Maddenson and perhaps one more. This draws me into my own complex feelings about experiencing joy, desire, etc. in the context of a world that calls so unyieldingly for our moral responsibility, a world that is burning. Thank you so much for that, Akiva. And what I want to say is I think that the text here can be read in two different directions in light of that comment. On the one hand, when the world is burning and you are in the middle of the burning, you are part of the people whose world is on fire. When you're in Egypt, this text would say, I think, that one of the greatest merits that you can have is to lean into that joy, into that desire. And also, well, actually, we'll hold off on the end also until next class when we talk about reunions and we talk about meeting with other people who may have suffered differently and may be suffering differently. Let's see. We're going to continue to the third source. And again, I really encourage you to read the comments. I'm going to read this one last comment from Lissa Gelber because I think that it's beautiful. For the first time in her life, 11 years, I've said goodnight to my child in person every night. Thinking about how to transform anticipatory mourning about that loss moving into whatever the future looks like. That's beautiful, and I think speaks to a lot of people's experiences of the small joys that we found in the middle of this. Let's read one more source for now from the Shev Shmaisa. And Moshe heard the people weeping, each family apart, each person at the entrance of his tent. Rashi on this verse explained that each family apart, the mishpachotehem, which can also be read as for their families, means because of family affairs, because of the prohibitions of blood relatives that had been forbidden to them. Rashi says that why are the people crying? And he looks at the word mishpachotehem and says they're actually crying because they now have additional limits on who they are allowed to engage in sexual relationships with. And one of those limits is actually on family members. And that's actually what they're crying about. The Shev Shmaisa has the same reaction that I think many of us do to this interpretation, which is, and that is astonishing. It is indeed. As what does the quarrel of the man have to do with matters of sexual prohibitions? And it appears that it can be explained according to what the rabbis, may their memory be blessed, said about that which is found in the Gemara. And they stood at the lowermost part of the mountain, B'tachti Tahar, which can also be read as in the lowermost part of the mountain. This teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, overturned the mountain above the Jews like a tub and said to them, if you accept the Torah, excellent, but if not, there will be your burial. Let's take a step back to make sure that we all understand what's going on so far. There is a place, the Gemara says that what actually happened at Egypt, it says that the Jews stood at the foot of the mountain, B'tachti Tahar, but that's taken in some places to actually mean under the mountain. And what do we mean by that? The idea is that God actually didn't simply offer the Torah to the Jewish people, but threatened them. God took the mountain and held it above their heads and said, if you accept the Torah, wonderful. If not, I will drop this mountain and this will be your burial place. This is interpreted variously in various different ways. Some people take this idea very seriously. God actually in this moment is threatening to kill the Jewish people if they do not accept it. Others, I think, take it equally seriously, but perhaps more metaphorically. What does it mean that God is threatening the Jewish people here, that God is taking away their ability to choose? If you had been liberated from Egypt with miracles and signs and wonders and had seen the 10 plagues, you also would not be able to really robustly choose something here. And the Shev Shmaisa says this actually is the crux of the matter that the Jewish people are longing for in this moment. And behold, we have found that they desired a desire, meaning that they did not have any physical desire. And as it is written by the Alshich, they desired that they would have desire. See there. And according to what I have written, the reason is that on account of the man that was from the minister of Torah, and was the bread of the mighty ones, all of their wish and yearning was only for Torah. and their souls were dry and empty from all physical desire. And so they desired desire, such that the receiving of the Torah could be of their wish and wanting, like when they said, "We will do and we will hear, as no one wishes forth love." Therefore, they quarreled about the man and its forcing the love of Torah upon them. And when they said, "We remember the fish that we used to eat free, chinam, in Egypt," its explanation is that it was without force, but rather it was that which we chose and which appealed to us. And this is the understanding of the word chinam. The Shev Shmaisa is saying something incredible here, which is that, yes, we have this idea that we saw before, that the Jewish people are desiring desire, and that somehow has been taken from them either by this robust system of mitzvot, or according to him, something happens in the eating of the man that does it. But for him, it's the biggest loss that comes with that isn't the desire for sensuality, isn't the desire for physical things, but their ability to choose, their ability to want, their ability to desire freely. And what is it that they miss being able to desire freely? Torah. God has given them the Torah at this point by force. Not only that, they are, according to the Shev Shmaisa, eating the man every day, which also makes them desire Torah, makes them have to, in some way, buy into this being able to desire only Torah, and they miss being able to desire of their own free will. And I want us to take a step back here. So much of the past year has been, for many of us, dreaming. It's been about the desire. It's been about what are the quote unquote normal things that we want so desperately. And I think for some of us, that actually has become a way of staying alive in the face of all of this. What is it that I still have within me? Even when I haven't seen my family, even when I'm lonely, even when I feel like life as I know it is never going to happen again, I have my dreams, I have my desire, I have my wanting of those normal things. And some of them are so mundane. What do I want? What do I dream of? Taking the subway again every day. What do I want? What do I dream of? Going into a physical place for work every day. What do I want? What do I dream of? Going to the grocery store. And when that happens, it will be joyous and it will be actually a miracle. And also something will have been taken from me. Because in that moment, these things will no longer be able to be things that I dream of, things that I want. They will simply be things that I have to do. And I imagine that if we take this text seriously, if we are willing to put our own everyday systems of obligation in there as using Torah as a placeholder in this frame, lahavdil, the things are not the same, then what we find is that the Shev Shmaisa is actually offering a vision of sometimes the biggest loss is of no longer dreaming, but of being obligated. And I think for some of us, that actually will be something that we have to travail as well. And I'm curious if that's going on for other people as well. If this touches anywhere in you, feel free to offer that in the chat. I see that I missed quite a bit in the chat, including a Rolling Stones reference, which is probably good because I embarrassingly would not have been able to follow it anyway. But I'm going to read a few of the comments before we move on. Let's see. I'm going to start from Janet Collidner. There was an article in the New York Times last week about languishing. Yes. Many of us are not depressed, but we also don't feel completely all of the desires we have when emotionally fully healthy. I think we're not all desiring that we'll desire Torah, but I think all this languishing has left many of us without being able to get our energy together to make things happen. What will it be like when we get that back? Will we get it back or will we continue to languish? I think I worry about that. Thank you for pointing that out. I think that that's absolutely true, that for some of us, there has been this dreaming, and for some of us as a protective mechanism, there has been this shutdown of dreaming. I think that's what part of what languishing is. And that fear of, will I ever be able to get that back, really resonates. David Weisberg, little things feel miraculous. Endorphin rushes from seeing a congregant at something other than a funeral or a b'nai mitzvah. Absolutely. Bob Schloss, when everyone is back to normal work in the office, work in the factory, work in the store, or going to school, there may be an end to the mana of online Torah study. Oh, I hope not, which I've received in the last 13 months from Hadar Shalom Hartman Institute, JTS Olive, and so many others. We'll talk about this more in the class on rebuilding, but I certainly hope that that is something that we have actually learned and will incorporate to the rebuilding after this period of what I'll call exile for the sake of the structure. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to read one more comment by Alana Axel. I'm concerned that we will rush back into almost regular life and I will forget the many lessons that I have learned during COVID. I will miss the incredible online teaching I've done this year, such as this lecture. Thank you for this. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I hope that part of what we're doing by identifying what are the places that I will miss, what are the places that are making me scared to open the door, I hope that part of what we're doing is starting to think about the things that can be transported to the other side, the things that are actually able to exist in that other world if we dream it. How do we make sure preemptively that that happens? How do we not simply get caught up in the rush of back to normal without expanding our imaginations of what normal could look like? The source that we saw about the tasting in the man correctly identified how difficult it is to imagine what you have not yet seen. And also, I think, spurs us on to the commitment of, and yet I have to try. We're going to continue to two different sources. Well, one different source and a closing thought about a text that I think begins to give us an image of, and yet, even when we're afraid and even when there will be loss on the other side, in some ways, what does it take to open the door? Or in this case, what does it take to leave the cave? This is the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. I'm sure many people have heard it before. We're going to actually today be focusing on what happens after the cave. Rabbi Yehuda opened. This is a conversation between three rabbis who are sitting around and discussing the Romans. Rabbi Yehuda opened. How pleasant are the deeds of this nation. They establish markets, they establish bridges, they establish bathhouses. Rabbi Yossi was silent. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai responded and said, all that they establish, they only establish for their own needs. They establish marketplaces to place prostitutes in them, bathhouses to pamper themselves in, and bridges to collect taxes from all who pass over them. Yehuda ben Gerim went and related their statements, and they were heard by the monarchy. They ruled and said, Yehuda, who elevated the Roman regime, shall be elevated and appointed. Yossi, who remained silent, shall be exiled to Tzipori. Shimon, who disgraced the government, shall be killed. And this is how Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son end up in the cave. They went and they hid in a cave. A miracle occurred and a carob tree was created for them and a spring of water. They would remove their clothes and they would sit up to their throats in the sand and they studied Torah all day. At the time for prayer, they dressed in their clothes and prayed and removed their clothes so that they would not tatter. They sat in the cave for 12 years. Elijah came and stood at the opening of the cave. He said, who will inform Bar Yochai that the emperor has died and his decree is nullified? They went out and they saw that people were plowing and sowing. This is the first exit from the cave. I only realized this when I read this source again a few weeks ago, but just like our opening from COVID is not a one-time thing for so many of us in so many different states, there were the openings and then we were sent back into lockdown and then came out again. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son have the same experience. They went out and they saw that people were plowing and sowing. He said they forgo eternal life and busy themselves with this life. Every place that they placed their eyes immediately was burned. A bat kol emerged and said to them, a divine voice emerged and said to them, "Did you emerge in order to destroy my world? Go back to your cave." Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is angry that people are carrying on with their normal lives and not studying Torah. It's an obscenity to him. And I wonder, reading this, if part of that anger is actually a result of having been alone for so long, meaning when you are alone for so long, when you're in the isolation that we have all been in, and you come out and the world has decided that it will just continue as normal without acknowledging where you have been, where everyone else is living their lives as if that's just what's supposed to be. How can you not feel anger? And I imagine that for some of us coming out, that is going to be the case. I think we all in the past year have experienced things that we never imagined we would. We've experienced a sort of loneliness that we never anticipated. For many of us, we experienced loss upon loss. And we're in some ways being expected to come back out into a world that will function, quote unquote, as normal, even as we have changed so much. There's a difference here. We all have been in our own caves, and yet, what will it feel like when we are at the first party, when we are at the first time where everyone is engaging as if this year never happened? How will we not feel anger in that moment? How will we not feel resentment in that moment? For Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the answer is he couldn't. And that was so true that he began to burn the world. They went back into the cave and sat there for 12 months, for they would say the judgment of the wicked in Gehenna lasts for 12 months. A bat kol emerged and said, "Emerge from your cave." They emerged. Everywhere that Rabbi Elazar would strike, that's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's son, Rabbi Shimon would heal. Rabbi Shimon said to him, "My son, it is enough in this world, you and me." This is Rabbi Shimon's first step to healing. There is someone else here who understands what I went through. There is someone who is there with me out in this world. And that, for him, is enough. As the sun was setting on Shabbat Eve, they saw an elderly man carrying 2 bundles of myrtle and running at twilight. They said to him, "Why do you have these?" He said to them, "In honor of Shabbat." They said, "And let one suffice?" He said, "One corresponds to remember the Shabbat, and one corresponds to observe the Shabbat." He said to his son, "See how beloved the mitzvot are to Israel." Their minds were put at ease. If this is a recipe for how do you find your way in the world after having been alone for so long, how do you find your way in the world when it seems like all it wants to do is carry on as normal and you know that nothing can ever really be normal again? The story is giving us what I think is a 3-step recipe. The first, find someone who knows what you went through, in whatever way that is. For Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that's his son. For many of us, part of the horror of this year is that we have actually been entirely alone. No families, no roommates, and that's a different sort of sorrow. And yet, what might it look like to find someone who can understand? Step 2, find a moment of beauty. The Gemara here goes out of its way to really paint the picture. Twilight, 2 myrtles, the conversation. That's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's first experience of beauty in the world again. And for him, beauty is always comes through the lens of Torah, comes through the lens of the Jewish people loving mitzvot. And yet that allows him, in some way, a little bit of peace, a little bit of beginning to be in the world again. And now we're going to see what I think step 3 is. Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, his son-in-law, heard and went out to greet him. We have a new character in the family. This is a family member who was not in the cave and yet is going out for this encounter. He's going to re-meet Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. This is our first moment of what I'll call reunion. He brought him into the bathhouse and he was tending to his flesh. He saw that Rabbi Shimon had cracks in the skin on his body. Let's remind ourselves, in the cave, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son were naked and buried in sand as they were learning Torah. And in the moment of the cave, there's something idyllic about it. There's something almost Eden-like about it. And yet, the story only now is bringing our attention to, and this is the toll that it took. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai has cracks all along the skin in his body. And his son-in-law is taking him for the first time to a place where that can be tended to. He was crying and the tears fell from his eyes and caused him pain. Rabbi Pinchas said to him, "Woe is me that I have seen you like this." Rabbi Pinchas is looking at him and saying, "I'm so sorry that I have to see you suffering like this. This is breaking my heart." Rabbi Shimon said to him, "Happy are you that you have seen me like this, as had you not seen me like this, you would not have found me in this." The last line is enigmatic, but here's what I think Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai on some level is saying. Don't feel bad that you are seeing me like this, that you are seeing me with the wounds in my skin, that you are seeing the toll that the last 12, 13 years have taken on me. Don't feel bad that you are seeing me in this moment of utter vulnerability. If you had not seen me like this, if you had not seen me in this way, exposed and open with the cracks, with the wounds, you actually would not have found me. You actually would not have truly seen me at all. And here's what I think the story has to say that is maybe most valuable for us as we step out of the cave. We've had the find someone who knows what you went through, who's able to be in that boat with you. We've had to find a moment of beauty. And here, the story in its last, I think, step for recovery is actually daring us to take off what I'll call here our masks. When you go back out into the world after isolation, part of what it takes to reintegrate is to allow other people to see the places where you have cracked, to allow other people to see the wounds that you carry, to allow other people to see what you have gone through. And I want us to remind us before we move on of Rabbi Shimon's words, if you had not seen me like this, if you had not seen the cracks in my skin, if you had not seen me crying, you would not have found me. And here I want us to go back for a moment to the first source. We don't have to scroll all the way back up, but the first source says that when the Jewish people cried that night, when they were longing for the cucumbers, when they were longing for the onions, when they were longing to go back to Egypt, with all of the fear that contains, they cried the mishpachotehem with their families and at their own tents. And what I want to share in this last moment, if I may, is a piece of writing that I once did about Bamidbar and what actually is happening in that moment, why they're crying the mishpachotehem, and why that actually is an impediment to their moving on, to their being able to come back out into the world. Let's scroll down if we can. What I didn't realize when I first learned Bamidbar is that Bamidbar tells the truth. It tells the truth about moving from one home to another, that even if the new one is beautiful and miraculous, there will be moments of homesickness, of fear, of desperate craving for the taste of what was once home and now feels too far away. There will be moments when abundance and blessing feel too big and we feel too small to embrace it. There will be moments when, on the journey to truly inhabiting a new home, all we want to do is turn around and run to what we once knew. But Bamidbar also tells the truth about when that fear turns toxic, when we retreat to our own tents and cry alone. We're told that on those nights of tears, the Jewish people cried in groups, divided, each with their own families. And so we are left to wonder, what might have been if the nation had cried together? What might have been if the fear was not a dividing force, but a uniting one? What if in fear we had not run away from each other and from God, but towards them? I cannot wish us freedom from fear of new blessed homes. I cannot wish us freedom from the occasional drive to move backwards. Those are false blessings, I think, the fantasy of a 13-year-old. The age I was when I first learned the story of Bamidbar, by the way. Instead, I wish us the ability to stay with each other in those moments of fear. I wish us the ability to hold hands and cry together when our fears tell us to run away to our own shelters and cry alone. I wish us the knowledge that home is the place where you do not have to run away to be alone when you are frightened. More than anything, I wish for all of us that redemptive gift of home. Here's where I want to leave us tonight. I don't think that there is a way to run past the fear that will be involved in reopening for many of us. That, of course, is the fears that we discussed tonight, and also for many of us, actually really concrete fear of what if I get sick? What if the world is still dangerous? But what I think Bamidbar offers us, and what I think the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai coming out of the cave offers us, is that part of the way through is to find each other. Part of the way through is to find each other, to show each other where the past year has brought out the cracks, to let us cry together at night instead of retreating and crying on our own. I wish everyone, as much as possible, bravery and courage in moving forward. And I'm excited, please God, next week to keep learning with so many of you about what opportunities reopening might offer us as we come together again. Thank you so much, everyone. Good night and be well.